Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Hi, my name is Kevin Wong and I am the Director of the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park, which is the educational program of the Joshua Tree National Park Association. With me is Lara Roselle of the National Park Service, who originally proposed a series of webinars to train park staff on park-specific topics while they are working remotely during this pandemic. We will be your hosts and the producers of these webinars. Before we get started, I'd like to offer some tips on how to use this webinar effectively. As internet bandwidth is being heavily used in California due to the stay-at-home direction, and so many of us are working remotely, we may have issues with internet connections. If you have audio or monitor issues during this webinar, it may be due to having too many programs open on your computer, including email or Facebook, which have regular updates. These will reduce your access to the bandwidth. In addition, when the webinar begins, you will see a small control panel on your screen, generally in the upper right-hand corner. There is a question mark and a dialog balloon. If you click on the question mark, you can ask questions that we will present to the speaker during his presentation. We will also unmute the audience at the end of the presentation so you can ask questions. Please try not to ask all your questions at the same time. At this time, we'll begin. Today's presentation is Birds of Joshua Tree National Park, Part 2, with Kurt Leuschner. Kurt, thank you for being here today.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I want you to know that even though you can't see me, I got it all cleaned up for this presentation. And afterwards, I'm going to take an adventure over to Costco. So wish me luck. But anyway, back to the birds. When we left off last week, we were talking about American kestrels and how some of them migrate and others don't. And this is the most common form of migration among birds, what we call partial migration. You don't see a lot of coots in Joshua Tree National Park, but occasionally they do show up at Barker Dam and places where there is water. But we sure have a lot of them down here in the low desert. And because they're not ducks, they get out of the water and get in all kinds of trouble on the golf courses. So it's an issue down here I get a lot of phone calls about. So we're trying to do our best to live with the coots. Northern flickers and robins are winter visitors, winter residents of the deserts, including Joshua Tree and migrants. They're usually not here during the summer, although a few robins are starting to stick around in places like Lucky Park. So you might want to watch for robins during the summer. And if you see any, make sure you document those on eBird. But normally these birds would move up the slopes and up into the High Sierra during the summer and to spend the winter with us. The flicker is the only woodpecker you'll commonly see hopping on the ground on the lawns and on the grassy areas because it likes to eat ants. Here's a couple other what we call altitudinal migrants, and they're also somewhat irregular. So some years you have more, others less. Mountain quail do occur in the park. Not commonly, but Black Rock is one of the areas in the higher parts of Black Rock to watch for them, and also around Keys View. And Lewis's woodpecker, maybe once in a decade we get an outbreak of them, and they occur in the desert. Very irregular. Some more altitudinal type migrants that might come down into the park if you were to get a big snowstorm include red crossbills, band-tailed pigeons, and dark-eyed juncos, which are fairly common most winters. These are birds you'd expect to see if you went up to the top of the Palm Springs Tramway, for example. They nest up there. And the bird with probably the shortest migration of all is the Clark's nutcracker, about 100 yards. Doesn't venture too far down the slope. And usually you have to go above 6,000 feet to see this bird. Again, the top of the Palm Springs Tramway and the peak, which is almost close to 11,000 feet, is a good place to see Clark's nutcracker. Red-breasted nuthatch is what we call an eruptive migrant. So in years where there's more food available in the desert region or less food available in the mountains, these birds will wander widely and show up in our backyards and in Joshua Tree National Park. Again, maybe once a decade we'll get an eruption of red-breasted nuthatches. Other years we won't see any in the park. When it comes to owls, a lot of owl species don't migrate at all, but some do. And the long-eared owl is an example of a species of owl that does migrate. However, they're irregular in their migrations and not all of them migrate, so they're partial migrants. But occasionally, or in some years, we'll get them nesting in the park, maybe more than one pair. And then other years we'll have no long-eared owls. So it's quite variable. They do look a lot like great horned owls. So if you see an owl that you think might be a great horned owl perched in a tamarisk tree, for example, look closely, make sure it's not a long-eared. They look like a great horned owl kind of on a diet. They're slimmer and trimmer, as you can see, and their ear tufts, those feathers on top of their head, are more vertical compared to a great horned owl. This little owl shows up every now and then in the winter in the desert. We've had a couple that wintered here in Palm Desert at the Living Desert. There was one that wintered in Big Morongo Preserve one winter. So you just never know. If you live in the desert region, including Joshua Tree, there's always a chance that a saw-whet owl will come down from the mountains and spend the winter in your backyard. But otherwise, it's not a bird that you expect to see in Joshua Tree most years. Now, I do a whole talk on California condors, which we possibly could do in the future, but there's now I'm happy to say, over 500 California condors. So the program has been very successful to bring them back. They were down to an all-time low of about 22 birds back in 1982. About half of those 500 are in captivity, and the other half are spread among 4 populations. The nearest population is just north of LA in the Sespe Wilderness. And one of those Sespe birds wandered over to Big Bear a few years ago. And Big Bear, as you know, is not that far from Joshua Tree, so it's just a matter of time before we see one of these condors circling over Joshua Tree National Park, and we can add it back to the list. So I'm looking forward to that day. So be on the lookout. Now, blue-footed boobies occur down here in the low desert at the Salton Sea every month of the year, but September and October are best. I don't expect you to see one in Joshua Tree National Park, but you never know. So keep checking Barker Dam, and one day we might record this bird in the park. Lawrence's goldfinch is much less common than the lesser goldfinch, which is the one you normally see, but it's one of the specialty birds of the region and of Joshua Tree. So be on the lookout for it. It's not quite as yellow as the lesser goldfinch. It's got little gold patches here and there, and the male looks like he's dipped his face in black paint. One of the best places to see him is just outside the park in Big Morongo Canyon Preserve and Covington Park. But again, they could occur anywhere in and around Joshua Tree National Park where there might be water. This is an interesting bird that I could probably spend a lot of time talking about. It's very unusual in many ways. It's a tropical bird called the Phainopepla. And at least some members of the species have more of an east-west migration as opposed to a north-south. So they'll spend time on the coast. Maybe in the summer, they'll go to the coast and feed primarily on insects. And then in the winter, they'll come out to the desert, nest again in a second time during the year. And this time they'll feed mostly on mistletoe berries. And certain studies have shown that the digestion of the mistletoe berries actually helps the seeds to germinate when it comes out the other end. So there may be some kind of mutualism, symbiosis going on here between Phainopeplas and mistletoe. So they are the primary spreaders of mistletoe in the desert, along with probably mockingbirds, number 2. And when they poop, it looks kind of like this. So this is what we call a tetrascata, which means poop pyramid in Greek. And so beneath the favorite perch, it's called the banner perch of the Phainopepla, this pile of droppings will build up. And from this, a new mistletoe plant will germinate. So maybe you've seen these tetrascatas. I'm kind of collecting pictures of them, so feel free to send them to me anytime, and one day we'll publish them. You may know this particular tetrascata. If it looks familiar to you, it's because it's on the Oasis Trail, just off of the Oasis Visitor Center. It's one of the biggest ones I've ever seen. Now, researchers, when they catch migrant birds like this Wilson's warbler, not only are they putting bands on their legs, but they're also plucking a feather. And they can get information from a single feather, kind of like pulling the hair out of your head, where they can actually read these different isotopes that are contained within the structure of the feather, and they can tell where the bird has been hanging out in the past year or more based on the isotopes that are in certain parts of the feather. And so this new data set from these isotopes from the feathers has allowed researchers to determine that a number of birds like this Wilson's warbler do something called leapfrog migration. That means certain populations that may winter or summer in Alaska, for example, are actually going all the way down, say, to northern South America and leapfrogging other populations of Wilson's warblers that have a much shorter or protracted migration. Let's say another population of Wilson's warbler might summer in the Sierra, and maybe they'll spend the winter in Mexico. So they'll have a really short migration, while this other population is completely leapfrogging that one. And you might ask, well, why is this information important? Well, when you're trying to protect habitat for birds, it is important to know where the birds are going and where they're originating from, so you can protect both ends of the spectrum there, both the summering grounds and the wintering grounds. These are more night migrants, summer. These two species winter in Joshua Tree National Park, yellow-rumped warbler and orange-crowned warbler, and they migrate at night, and they're also part of that leapfrog migration I was just explaining. So if you see a warbler in the winter time, it's likely to be one of these two, especially the yellow-rumped warbler. Now, they won't look as bright as the picture here in the winter. They'll look more like a brownish, streaky sparrow with just a little dull yellow on them, but they're quite common. And the orange-crowned warbler is less common, but some of them do winter in the area of Joshua Tree National Park, while most of the others go down to Mexico. Oops. Now, a lot of people are interested in roadrunners. There's no evidence to show that roadrunners migrate, but they do seem to be less active in the winter, and maybe they hunker down and just aren't as visible. So it sometimes seems like they've totally disappeared from a region, but they're probably still around. They're just not as visible or active. They can fly, but they prefer to run top speed 18 miles an hour. Now, among the thrashers, we've got a few species actually that occur in the park, and some migrate and some don't. It turns out the Lacan's thrasher, which you might see around Cottonwood, is a permanent resident. Whereas the Bendire's thrasher, which is seen on the other end of the park near the west entrance, is a migrant. And so they're only going to be here in the summer. You won't expect to see one in the winter. They're not common, by the way. And they're probably less common today than they were, say, 2 decades ago. So climate change might be having an effect on this bird and its occurrence in the park. Now, why do birds migrate? There's a lot of reasons when you think about it. Up in the north during the summer, you've got the midnight sun and you've got abundant food. A lot of these birds eat mosquitoes and small insects, and so they can feed all day long and there's all the food they can eat. So that's a reason to risk flying all the way, say, up to Alaska. They also migrate to get away from something that they don't like, in this case, cold weather and lack of food, which is a lot of the reason, that Canadians come down here in the winter, right? They're getting away from something. But when you really boil it down, it's really all about the food, either flying somewhere where there is going to be abundant food or getting away from somewhere where there isn't going to be enough food to get them through. Some migration facts. You may wonder how far birds migrate in a day. And of course, this varies tremendously depending on the weather and the species and lots of factors. But here are some numbers for you. Thrushes maybe travel anywhere from 66 to 234 miles in a day. Purple martins can travel up to 358 miles on a good day. Typical speed might be 20 to 40 miles an hour. And of course, this varies. So I'd say, a typical bird on a typical day might be flying, close to 100 miles before it sets down. And again, remember, most birds migrate at night, so they're setting down about 4 or 5 in the morning somewhere. In the spring, which is now, birds tend to be in more of a hurry because they want to establish their breeding grounds and stake out those breeding grounds and get ahead of everybody else. In the fall, migration is much more slow. It's slower and it's more extended because they're not in a hurry like they are in the spring. For instance, just last week in my yard here in Palm Desert, I had all kinds of black-headed grosbeaks moving through every day, and now today and yesterday, nothing. So I think the wave of black-headed grosbeaks has already passed my yard, and it only lasted about 2 weeks. Some more trends in migration. The males usually migrate first because the females are left behind to take care of the kids. And so the males leave first. They don't travel together. Young birds are usually flying further south, believe it or not, than their parents. So it's not like they give the kids a break. They make them fly even further south to less suitable wintering grounds than the parents have. That's just part of being a first year or second year bird. You don't get the choice wintering areas. These young birds who are not migrating with their parents, by the way, they're just migrating on their own, are definitely more apt to get lost because it's their first migration and they've never been to where they're going, and there's nobody there to show them which way to go either. So that's what makes fall birding very exciting, even compared to spring birding, because you never know what you're going to see in the fall. You see a lot of these lost birds that are way off course. And females also tend to winter further south than males. Again, the males want to get the jump start every spring so they can get to the breeding areas first and set up shop and defend their territory. And so they don't want to be too far away. So they migrate shorter distance compared to the females. So they're really not spending time together, the males and the females, except for a very brief period when they're breeding. These are some rare birds that have occurred in Joshua Tree National Park. So always be on the lookout for something strange, especially in the fall. Blue-throated hummingbird, which you normally see down in Mexico and in southeast Arizona, has occurred in the park. And also red-faced warbler, another what we call a neotropical migrant, has occurred in Joshua Tree National Park. But normally you'd go to Arizona, southeast Arizona, to see these tropical specialties. Again, more birds migrate at night than during the day, and here's a couple more night migrants, these vireos. The most common vireo that you might see in migration in the park right now is the warbling vireo. Second most common might be the Cassin's vireo, the one on the lower right, with more of a spectacle. When they're flying at night, they're usually flying by themselves. There's no real advantage to flocking at night. Some laws that have helped birds over the years. Just over 100 years ago, we had the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was a partnership with the US and Canada, because we share a lot of birds with our neighbors to the north, of course. In 1934, the first duck stamp was issued. It was $1 back then. Today, it's 20-something dollars. These are hunting licenses for ducks, but a lot of people, myself included, buy these stamps every year to support conservation. The money raised goes to help the National Wildlife Refuge system, which is where a lot of us bird watchers like to go to see birds, not necessarily to hunt them. But you can imagine over the years, this program has raised, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars for the National Wildlife Refuge system. So that started in 1934. And then in 2000, it only took us about, 92 years to get this right. We realized that we better have a good partnership with our neighbors to the south as well, because many or most of our migrant birds winter south of the border. And we needed treaties, and in this case, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act passed in order to help protect the wintering grounds of a lot of our summer breeders. So that happened in the year 2000. Here's the two most common hummingbirds of the area, including Joshua Tree. Anna's hummingbird, you'll see throughout the year in a variety of habitats, even in your own backyard, has kind of a reddish throat or gorget in the male. And on the left is the Costas hummingbird. This is our typical desert hummingbird. It's a little more common down here in the low desert, but it's also can be quite common in the Mojave and the high desert as well. Has more of a purple gorget that extends out further than the Annas. So if you learn just two hummingbirds, try to learn these two, Costas and Annas, because you'll see them year round most places you go. Now, hummingbirds migrate too, at least ours do. The ones in the tropics don't, because they don't have to. Why would they want to leave? They've got all the food they need year round. But our hummingbirds here in North America, of course, have to deal with winter weather and no flowers. And so they need to leave certain regions when the weather changes, of course. Some just come up and down the slopes a little bit, like the Anna's hummingbird. You know, some of them migrate, some don't. Some migrate further. Some migrate very short distances. And other hummingbirds, like the rufous hummingbird, travels thousands of miles from as far north as Alaska all the way down into central and southern Mexico. The rufous is, by the way, moving through right now, so watch for it at your feeders. It's more of an orangey color, and it's very aggressive and noisy, and so you'll often hear it when it shows up at your hummingbird feeders. It'll kind of scare the other hummingbirds away. The ruby-throated hummingbird back east goes about 500 miles across the Gulf of Mexico at 25 miles an hour. So if you do the math, that's 20 hours of straight flight across the Gulf, and there's no chance to stop on the way. They have a kind of a fifth gear, these hummingbirds, and so they can slow their wing beats down from 80 beats a second down to 60 beats a second to save fuel when they're doing things like crossing the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, they've got to fatten up before a big flight like that. So back east, again, the ruby-throated is doing this. Out here in the west and through Joshua Tree National Park, the rufous hummingbird is our champion migrant hummingbird that you want to watch for in spring and in fall for a couple of weeks. This rufous hummingbird unfortunately didn't make it. I took this photo in Cottonwood. That's a catclaw acacia, and obviously a shrike captured this young male rufous hummingbird and skewered it on a catclaw for later lunch. But rufous hummingbirds are complete migrants. Again, that means all members of the species migrate. Now, how high do birds fly when they migrate? Of course, this varies tremendously. If you're looking for world records, it might be this vulture that was clocked at 37,000 feet, but that's not typical. Hawks, of course, can fly high, and sometimes they do, but they prefer to stay at 5,000 feet or below unless there's something in their way they need to get over, like a mountain range. Different types of migrants that migrate include soaring migrants. These are birds that migrate by day, like hawks, and use thermals to keep themselves aloft, whereas powered migrants are using the power of their own wing beats to propel them through the air. Picture a duck flapping and flapping hard, or a goose, migrating. Those are powered migrants. A lot of our night migrants, of course, are, in fact, most of them are powered migrants. This is a soaring migrant that's passing through as we speak. It's called the Swainson's hawk. They're not common in Joshua Tree, but they are sometimes seen in the spring and in the fall, heading to either central California or as far north as Canada and maybe even Alaska. They're going to nest in an open plains kind of a situation. And they winter as far south as Argentina. It turns out that Borrego Springs, you're familiar with Anza-Borrego Desert State Park, they have a wonderful migration of Swainson's hawks every spring. It starts around the 1st of March, but especially around the 15th of March and goes till about the 15th of April, about today. So during that month or so window, they get thousands and thousands of these Swainson's hawks funneling through Borrego Springs. And every day there's hawk watchers out there, volunteers, both morning and in the evening, counting these hawks. So if you ever get a chance to go over there during March or April, you should do that to see these Swainson's hawks. But they do sometimes pass over Joshua Tree. This is the guy they're named after. He never saw the hawk, actually. He was lived in New Zealand, but a lot of these birds that are named after people were named in the 1800s, and they often bear the name of somebody who never saw the bird. They were just named in their honor. In this case, it was William Swainson. These soaring migrants, like hawks, again, usually stay 4,000 feet or below. Here are some hawks that occur in our area. The osprey on the left eats fish, so you normally wouldn't expect it in Joshua Tree National Park except during migration. I have seen them flying over the park, and sometimes they'll stop at a place like Barker Dam to check it out and hope that there might be fish in that water. So it's just something to watch for over the desert in the spring and maybe in the fall on their way to places like the Salton Sea. The red-tailed hawk in the lower right is our most common year-round resident, so it's in the park year-round. The tail is mostly red from above, as you can see. And then the ferruginous hawk in the upper right is a winter bird. They're not common in the park at all. You'd be lucky to see one, but there have been a few records of ferruginous hawks flying over the park or wintering in the area. Some other daytime soaring migrants that aren't hawks include pelicans. We used to have more pelicans because of the Salton Sea and the fish. Now we're not seeing as many, but you still might see some migrating over the park. Even this week, they're heading north. And of course, swallows fly over the park and even nest in the park in certain cases. This is the common barn swallow with a forked tail. Here's a couple of examples of nighttime powered migrants. The common yellow-throat is a little warbler that likes marshy areas. And the black-headed grosbeak, the one that's been in my yard the past couple of weeks, is heading north and hoping to find oak trees that it's associated with. So if you can start to learn some of the plants and some of the trees that certain birds are associated with, you can start to almost predict where you're going to see them, both on the breeding grounds and also in migration. Birds tend to choose plants to hang out in during migration that remind them of their breeding grounds. So for example, the black-headed grosbeak, even though it doesn't nest in scrub oaks, It nests in other kinds of oaks. It will occur in scrub oaks when it's migrating through Joshua Tree National Park. That's where you want to look for it. A lot of these small birds that fly at night fly very low, 2,000 feet or less, and that's why they hit a lot of objects, unfortunately, like cell phone towers and wind turbines. Powered migrants can vary the height that they migrate at, anywhere from 10 feet to 10,000 feet, depending on conditions. Nuttall's woodpecker is a bird. I'm not sure if it's on the park checklist yet. It's definitely on the hypothetical, but it might be because it occurs right outside the park in Big Morongo Canyon Preserve. So that's one to watch for. They look very similar to the ladder-backed woodpeckers, so you'll want to be careful about IDing them. These Nuttalls have an association with cottonwood trees, whereas the ladder-backed likes the desert plants, including Joshua trees. Here's a couple of other birds that have been expanding their range over the years and dispersing, you might say. The American crow, which occurs just outside the park. I'm not sure if there's any records in the park yet. Maybe some of you can let me know that. But if we don't have a record in the park yet, we will soon, because they occur in 29 palms and Joshua Tree in the urban areas. And it's just a matter of time before a few of them fly, inside the park boundary, and we can officially put them on the list. Great-tailed grackles in the upper right have been expanding their range for the past many, many decades. And they do occur in and around Joshua Tree National Park. And Eurasian collared doves in the lower right have also been expanding their range like crazy. They occur in all the states and in Canada and up in Alaska now. Their expansion in the last 20 years has been really remarkable. And so they're all over the place now, unfortunately, and perhaps crowding out some of our native dove species. So the Eurasian collared doves, as you can see, are large doves. They're very pale, and they have a black crescent on the back of their neck, on their nape. Also, their tail is very squared off, not pointed or graduated like a mourning dove. Eurasian collared dove, non-native. Harris's hawk is irregularly seen in the area, something to watch for, especially in the winter. Now, why would a bird want to migrate at night? Again, there's a lot of reasons for this. Night air is cool, and when you're powering your own flight, you build up a lot of heat. So you want to stay cool. There's also less chance of being preyed upon because predators don't tend to be as active at night. They can't see you either. Also, night air is nice and stable. So if you're not riding thermals, you're powering your own flight, you want stable air, and the night gives you that. Also, if you're flying at night, that means you can spend the day, or at least a good part of the day, foraging on the things that you like to eat, which include date-flying insects. So you're not wasting any precious daylight flying when you could be eating. And birds are known to use stars for navigation. And of course, the stars are visible at night. So there's 5 good reasons that most birds migrate at night. These are more night migrants that could be flying overhead tonight. And if you're lucky, they'll make a pit stop in the park and you'll get to see them. McGillivray's warbler, I've seen them right outside the Oasis Visitor Center and some of the low shrubs there in migration. Townsend's and hermit warblers are going to be in anything that might resemble a pine tree or a scrub oak. So maybe look for them along the Barker Dam Trail or Hidden Valley. And none of these birds are going to stay in the park. They're just going to pass on through and head up to the High Sierra or the Cascades or somewhere like that to summer. Sparrows are also night migrants, and they'll pit stop during the day in Joshua Tree. The Lincoln sparrow on the left has a lot of gray in the face. They're a fairly common migrant. And the brewer's sparrow winters in our area in the desert and also migrates through this time of year. It likes to nest in sagebrush areas. And the Salton Sea is not too far from Joshua Tree, so you do get a lot of water birds that fly over the park and occur on the park checklist. Maybe they don't spend a lot of time or any time in the park exactly, but they might be heading to places like the Salton Sea. So you'll see gulls flying over. If you're going to learn one gull, learn the one on the lower left, and that's the ring-billed gull. It's our most common inland gull, and you can see it has a black ring that goes all the way around the bill. The second most common inland gull would be the one in the upper right, and that's the California gull. Notice how its back or its mantle area is a little darker gray compared to the ring-billed gull. And look at its beak, and you'll see it, instead of having a black ring, it's got a black spot along with an orange spot. So that's called the California gull. That's the one that nests up in Mono Lake, by the way. So both of these gulls can occur flying over Joshua Tree, maybe stopping to rest every now and then if there's water. Of course, Canada geese can fly over at any time, and belted kingfishers occur in the park and migrate through the park on their way to places with water and fish. So you never know what you might see in migration. Now, gray vireo is a rare bird here in the Southwest. Their numbers are decreasing. Perhaps they should be on the endangered species list, but nevertheless, they used to summer in areas right behind Black Rock Visitor Center. But I don't think there's any recent records of gray vireos nesting there or anywhere in the park, but it's something to look for. If you wanted a little research project on the side, you could, really try to investigate the gray vireo occurrence in Joshua Tree National Park. And I would start with the Black Rock area to see if there's any birds at all occurring there, either in migration or during the breeding season. Lots of different ways to study migrant birds: radar, mist nets, spectral marking, radio telemetry, GPS tracking, and ceilometers. Here's some radar showing you what's called a fallout over the Texas coast. You see that green blob? Well, those are all masses of birds that have just crossed the Gulf of Mexico all night, and they pitch in to the nearest piece of woods they can find, and they're dead tired when they get there. And so there's a place called High Island, Texas. It's kind of famous for one of these fallouts. This little patch of woods called the Boy Scout Woods. And they've even set up bleachers there for the bird watchers to look at all these tired warblers and tanagers and grosbeaks that are just dripping from the trees after flying all night. This would be around first couple of weeks of April. Right now, actually, would be a good time to do this, if you could get there. So we use mist netting to capture birds safely and to band them, hoping to recapture them or having somebody else recapture them and then record that data. Sometimes we do special studies of populations of birds, and we'll mark them with special dyes or colored bands so we can identify the birds individually without having to recapture them each time. So if you ever notice a bird that's been marked in this way, you should take note of the sequence of colors on the legs and then report that to the U.S. Geological Survey, or send the information to me and I can pass it on for you. Birds that are big enough can have these whip antennas installed, and then you can track them using radio telemetry. They do this with condors and with waterfowl and other large birds. And they can also surgically implant small devices now that allow birds like bar-tailed godwits to be tracked all the way from Alaska to New Zealand. And with this new technology, these surgical implants, they discovered and confirmed recently that these godwits can fly nonstop over 7,000 miles from Alaska all the way to New Zealand. Imagine flying almost 9 days and over 7,000 miles without stopping. Amazing. And here's the route that they took from Alaska to New Zealand. You can see that in the spring, when they return to Alaska, they do a different route. They take a different route and they make some pit stops along the way. But in the fall, when they're heading south, it's a nonstop trip across the Pacific Ocean. Just amazing. We wouldn't have been able to prove this except for the new technology that allows these tiny little transmitters to be surgically implanted into the godwits. And as the technology advances, they'll be able to do the same thing with the smaller birds as well. Another way to track birds, which is really hard on the eyes, is to stare at the moon and count the number of birds passing through the field of view in a certain period of time, or to shine a giant beam up into the sky and do the same thing. You can get some estimates of how many birds are passing through at a given period of time. Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP, is an ongoing program to work with big cities in particular, like New York and Toronto and Chicago, that lie along these migratory pathways, to educate the cities and the people who live in them about the dangers of skyscrapers and leaving lights on at night that attract birds and cause millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of unnecessary bird deaths each year as birds smack into these obstructions. And more, we're putting more and more stuff up into birds' airspace. Cell phone towers are getting bigger, and wind turbines are getting taller, and transmission lines for electricity. There's just no end to the stuff we keep sticking up into the airspace, not always realizing the terrible effect it can have on these night migrating birds that fly very, very low, especially on cloudy nights. I also teach workshops to interested groups about making your own backyard into a wildlife habitat, because we can all do our part this way by creating a nice place for birds to stop at during their migration. It just involves doing a little bit of research about planting the right kind of native plants and providing the right food, water, and shelter that birds need during migration. So if everybody did their part, or if we got one house on every block to do something like this, that can start to make a big difference and give birds a place to stop. And that's the end of the talk. So we're going to have some time for questions if anybody's still out there.
We are out here and there are questions, Kurt. First question from Stephanie. Can you talk about how migration might have evolved, especially for species like the Arctic tern, which migrates so far?
Boy, that's a long answer, I think. But it's about survivability, obviously, and about finding food. And so you can just imagine populations of birds that ventured a bit further than other populations and stumbled on an abundant food source, were just able to survive that year and survive at all, and be able to breed and spread their genes to the next generation that did the same thing. And so it probably just happened incrementally, step by step. You can visualize that. But food is what drives it.
Next question. Molly says she was walking near her home in Flamingo Heights yesterday and saw a bird scurrying through the desert that was not a quail. It was a roadrunner. It was maybe about the size of a roadrunner, but more gray-brown, and looked similar to a grouse or a pheasant. So any info on that?
Well, if it wasn't a quail kind of bird, then it sounds like a thrasher. So maybe look up California thrasher, or even LeConte's thrasher, and see if that's possible. They run on the ground like roadrunners. They can fly, but they prefer to run, and they look like a little roadrunner or a quail. So I'd say thrasher.
And this question is anonymous. We've seen that different groups of birds you've been telling us, are a kettle or a descent or etc. What do you call a group of bird watchers?
Yeah, good question. I guess we'll have to make something up. Bird nerds or something. But no, I don't have an answer for that. But we should come up with a funny one. Those words they're called collective nouns. And there's all kinds of lists of these things if you want to look them up. And a lot of these names appeared in the 1600s, back in the feudal times when people were hunting and they wanted to put names on all the things that they were seeing or hunting. And so they came up with all these collective nouns that we use today.
All right, and Dave Larson wants to know if you have seen chukar in the park anywhere other than Lost Horse Mountain.
Personally, I haven't seen chukar in the park. So I guess Lost Horse Mountain is a place that somebody has seen them, but I haven't. You know, in chukar, they're introduced, so I'm not really sure their ongoing status in the park.
Okay, well, that makes the next question a challenging one. Do you know why they like Lost Horse?
Well, there must be water nearby, because they definitely kind of hang out near water sources, or not too far from them. So I don't know if there's a spring or some kind of a tanaha or something, but when you see chukar, you know that there's got to be water somewhere around, fairly close.
All right. And you mentioned that flocking is not advantageous at night. Can you explain why it is advantageous in the day?
Well, daytime migrants are much more visual. I mean, they're using landmarks because they can actually see the landmarks, right? And there's also advantages to hanging out with your buddies, because if somebody finds the right thermal, then you want to get in on that thermal too. So that's why these hawks all kind of go together, and then when somebody finds the thermal, they all follow along. And the same thing could be said for things like vultures. When it comes to finding food, sometimes they cheat off of each other and watch where the other vultures are going, etc. And then with birds like ducks and geese, if you've seen them fly in their V formations, you know, there's a lot of advantages to flying together and to kind of riding off the winds of the bird in front of you. You know, you can save energy that way in these V formations. So yeah, there's a number of reasons to flock during the day that wouldn't be there at night.
Marilyn also notes that she thinks chukars have been photographed at Pinto Y. Okay.
Well, good. I mean, yeah, just keep documenting these things and take photos and report them to eBird. And you know, I'm sorry I can't go out in the field with all of you and look at these birds right now, because that's the best way to learn the birds, right? Is to just get out there and look at them together. But we'll be able to do that, you know, hopefully soon. Remember to, you know, copy down my email, which you see on the screen there, and feel free to bug me anytime. You know, send me photos, ask me questions, and I'll enlighten you the best I can on anything about birds and bugs and anything else to do with natural history.
Right. Actually, during the pre-webinar, Kurt mentioned that he was watching his 5 desert tortoises in his backyard, and it turns out he's a connection for adopting desert tortoises. And oh, we have a suggestion that a group of bird watchers would be a passion of bird watchers.
Okay, I like that.
Okay, and we have a note that Dave Larson has heard a European starling imitate a Gambel's quail call. What other species have you heard them emulate?
Oh, wow. I don't listen to starlings as much as I should. I try to avoid them, but of course, mockingbirds imitate every bird under the sun. And I was listening to a mockingbird yesterday imitate a perfect western kingbird. And then I was listening to lesser goldfinches in my yard. They're also fantastic mimics. So when you have a little charm of goldfinches within view singing, listen closely and you might hear who they're mimicking. But yeah, I don't know about the starlings.
Cool. I hate to try to unmute everyone because on our last call that once again muted our speaker. So does anyone else have questions they want to type in?
I mean, you can try if you want.
Okay, well, I'll give it a try.
Yeah.
Okay, I hope now that we have unmuted all speakers, anyone can unmute their phone if you want to give comments or questions by voice.
This is Kurt. I mean, I'm here. Can you hear me, Kurt?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So that worked well.
All right. So at least I'm not muted.
It's always an adventure. We do have a request to make the presentation available for repeated viewing, which is certainly something I need to do to learn the birds. And yes, Kevin has been getting the links into the morning report of the previous presentations.
Great. Yeah, and I also want to just keep thanking Steve Myers, who took most of these photos. He's a great photographer, and he does a lot of birding in Joshua Tree. And also, I guess I'm going to be doing one of these on insects later this month. So, you know, if you tune in again, we can talk bugs a couple Wednesdays from now.
Yeah, I think Kevin is setting that up on the 29th.
Yep, same time. But I do,
Kevin,
you know, I thank everybody for attending. Any questions out there? Got all your questions answered? That's good.
I guess when the questions come up on repeated viewing, email Kurt. And we have the chance to give folks a quick break before our 2 o'clock all park call. And I see a number of folks saying, thank you so much, Kurt. And we'll all talk soon.
All right, you're all welcome, and keep watching those birds and sending in those reports.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Thank you.